Well, hello everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. We are saying hello from Zug, from the Crypto Valley. This afternoon we have prime speakers joining for this special event, State of the Art of Cryptography in Blockchains. First, I will welcome Mr. Ralph Kubli from CVBC, who will be a short introduction.
Thank you, Fabiola. Hello, my name is Ralph Kubli from CVVC. We are an early stage seed investor in blockchain-based companies. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to this online format on the state of the art in cryptography for blockchains. And we have a very prestigious group of speakers, as Fabiola pointed out. I will briefly outline what CVVC does in just a few sentences, and then Fabiola will talk about CV Labs, who is actually hosting the event and has organized the event. Why is it important that we talk about the Crypto Valley and not in crypto as in cryptography? Today, actually, it's the same, but typically when we refer to crypto, of course, we talk about cryptocurrencies and applications in the blockchain and DLT space. You know, Zug and Switzerland, in fact, have become a hotspot for crypto, so blockchain and DLT-based companies. Over 910, or probably more now, 920 companies that are related in business to blockchain have been established in Switzerland and Liechtenstein, in fact. You know, that means there's over 4,700 employees working in Switzerland on this topic. Just briefly to give you a sense of how important this sector really is in terms of valuations, CVVC is publishing a report on the top 50 companies that are based here in Switzerland. You know, they are valued at $37.5 billion. There are 6 unicorns in Switzerland. The 6 unicorns employ, now the top 50 companies employ 776 employees, have been funded with $3.7 billion. And it's important to note that, yes, of course, this funding does include ICO and token sales. However, we see more and more venture capital money flowing into the space. And as I mentioned before, there are 919 companies last time we counted, which was on June 30th, and you know, over 4,780 employees. As you can see on our wheel here, we broadly categorize blockchain technology companies. So these include platform companies and protocols. And then you have, of course, a very strong financial industry participation. And then there are some other applications based on blockchain as well, which are more and more valuable. CVVC itself, what do? We are running an incubation program. That's our primary way to invest in companies. We are a venture capital firm, basically investing in what we call the application layer, so in companies that are building a business model that is enabled by blockchain and DLT technology. We do have an advisory arm that helps startups and corporates navigate the space, and also obviously does publish the research that we've just cited. CV Labs, to which Fabiola will talk about, is our co-working space and is hosting the incubation program. And then, of course, we have a number of event formats, and including what we call the CV Maps, which is kind of the inventory, you know, of companies in the Crypto Valley. Here you can see an illustration of the incubation program, our last batch. We are now again starting to look for the brightest and most interesting and exciting startups for our next batch. So please do check out our website with under the heading of startups to potentially apply or understand what kind of companies that we are looking at. We intend to start this batch in the first quarter of 2020. It's, again, we mentioned blockchain focused. It's really specific. We have obviously in our midst quite a few founders, but there's a wide, really large and sophisticated ecosystem in Switzerland where founders that come to Switzerland or that participate in our programs can benefit from the latest technology, and the group of not only business people to commercialize, but certainly on the technical side, protocols that they can get exposed to, and among others, obviously also the breadth and the depth of the entire cybersecurity community. We invest up to 125,000 per company in this format. Then maybe I hand over to Fabiola, who will speak about the CV labs and the environment. And Fabiola is still on mute.
Well, I hope everybody can hear me now. Perfect. Yes, well, I want to welcome everybody to CV Labs, even if we are not physically there today. We are more than happy always to welcome you. CV Labs is a co-working space. We have different facilities. The biggest one is based in Zug, in Switzerland. We have other offices in Liechtenstein and as well in Dubai. And basically, next slide, please. CV Labs is really an ecosystem builder and is an arm from CBBC. So we have the co-working space, and as I mentioned, we do organize events and meetups like this one today. We run education programs as well as marketing and social media campaigns. We have an advisory department for specific blockchain projects, and we do excubation and incubation. That is the part that Ralph already mentioned. Well, just to close, these are some of the locations where we had physical presence, and some of our partners around the world. We are privileged. Some of our partners are joining this event today, so we welcome them from wherever they are joining, the US or from Asia. Without further ado, I will pass the word to Dr. Alan Sepanek, that he will start giving an intro on why cryptography is important.
Thank you, Fabiola. Hang on. You need to quit sharing your screen before I can share mine. There we go. Why cryptography matters, or why crypto matters, rather. So my task in this presentation is, let's see, how do we go to full screen? Present as slideshow. My task in this presentation is not to cut into the time of the other speakers, but rather to motivate the theme of this event, which is obviously the intersection between two worlds. On the one hand, according to some people, crypto means cryptography, and on the other hand, according to other people, crypto means cryptocurrency. And from my point of view, the intersection between those two worlds is rather small, and I'd like for it to be a little bit bigger. Given that crypto has this dual meaning, the title of my presentation is really sneaky because it sneaks in two questions. On the one hand, the question is why cryptocurrency matters, and in answering that, I'll chiefly be targeting cryptographers. And on the other hand, the question is why does cryptography matter? And for that, I'll chiefly be targeting cryptocurrency and blockchain enthusiasts. So within academic cryptography, there is this negative opinion, not uniformly held and held to various degrees, about cryptographer academics who leave academia to work in the blockchain industry. And we're seen as sellouts, perhaps, and I reject that point of view. I think it makes perfect sense for cryptographers to work on cryptocurrencies, and I'll make a couple of points in the first part of my presentation as to why. So first of all, cryptography is very, very important to money, and money is very, very important to civilization. And in order to make that point, you have to start from the question, what is money? So bear with me while I make an economic argument, because as you start thinking about this question, I don't think there is any way to escape the inevitable conclusion that not that cryptography is money, but rather that cryptography is the natural medium for money. And in order to come to this conclusion, you have to start from first principles, namely economies. And we're going to start from the bare bones. We have an economy with one person, Robinson Crusoe, and there are two goods in this economy. And already Robinson Crusoe has a need to decide what to allocate his time to. He can either spend time baking bread or spend time catching fish. And he can take any linear combination of those two extremal points, but there is a certain threshold, a trade-off curve that he cannot move beyond. And obviously in this primitive economy, there is no need for money. So whatever money is something that arises in larger economies. So let's add one extra person. Here we see an interesting incentive for collaboration, because even if the second person, Friday, is worse than Robinson at both catching fish and baking bread, they still both have an incentive to specialize in what makes them excel the most comparatively, and then make a trade. And by making that specialization and trade, they can both move to the right of their trade-off curves. That's known as the law of comparative advantage. Of course, specializing and then trading requires both of them to trust that the other person is keeping their end of the deal. So in this primitive economy, we already have an issue of trust, but still no issues regarding money. So if we add another good to this economy, then it might occur that Friday needs to spend time picking berries, for instance, not because he likes berries for himself, but he wants to use the berries to trade against Robinson's breads. This solves the non-coincidence of wants problem, because berries are now not useful to Friday for consumption, but as a medium of trading. And if you add a third person, then, or a fourth or a fifth, then the question of where do you specialize becomes very, very difficult. And these are, this gives rise to a problem of coordination, especially when you have economies with more people. The question is, where do you allocate your time to in a way that benefits not just other people, but yourself as well? These questions arise in the context of scaling economies, and money is the solution to these problems. Money solves the coordination problem through the pricing system, because by devoting your labor to whatever pays the best, you allocate your resources of your labor to that most urgently demanded location. So that's the description of the problem that money solves. And then we can go with an engineering perspective. What is money if it's the solution to this? Well, money exists in an adversarial context. It's a medium of exchange. And in order to solve the coordination problem, it has to be a carrier of information. And I think this is a key piece of information that other conventional definitions of money omit. Given that this is a definition of money, we can look at, okay, how do we make good money? And the answer is obviously cryptography. Cryptography is the science of protecting information. So it makes perfect sense for cryptographers to devote a lot of resources to money as a whole. All right. The next argument is no longer economical, but moral. And I'd like to draw attention to an excellent essay and speech by Philip Roggeway, in which he criticizes the academic cryptography community for a great failure as exposed by Edward Snowden 2 years prior. Obviously, Edward Snowden exposed the mass surveillance programs of the United States and other colluding states. And in the eyes of Philip Roggeway, this constitutes a monumental failure of the cryptography community, because they have the capacity to do something about it, and instead they like to study abstract problems that really don't see any practical use. He actually mentions the cypherpunks as a select group of cryptographers who actually do have real-world impact in relation to this surveillance state. And a couple of typical outputs of the cypherpunks are even mentioned. And in fact, Philip Roggeway does mention Bitcoin as well. He also lists a couple of interesting research topics in relation to offering resistance against the surveillance state. And one of them is secure private messaging in the untrusted server model. Now, what I think Philip Roggeway may have omitted, and perhaps after seeing this, he may agree, that another potential research topic that fits exactly in the same mold is secure private payments in the untrusted server model. He didn't mention that, but I think it is also implied by this excellent essay of Roggeway's. Now here's a second moral argument, or rather a civil libertarian argument, that you cannot have free speech without freedom of payments, and vice versa. The two go hand in hand. So if you think freedom of speech is a good thing, then you probably also need to think that freedom of payments is a good thing. And to see that freedom of speech implies freedom of payments, well, that's what cryptocurrencies already solved. In the end, you use your speech as a medium to broadcast a cryptocurrency transaction, and that makes the money move hands, change hands. To see that freedom of payment implies freedom of speech, consider that your speech exists on a medium like YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook, and those platforms these days are rather picky about which type of contents they allow, not necessarily nefariously so, that you can explain that behavior as a rational response to market incentives. WikiLeaks, to their credit, did not respond to economic incentives, and the credit card service providers cut their funding line. And for the longest time, and perhaps still so, the only way to support WikiLeaks is through cryptocurrencies. So much for why cryptocurrencies matter. In summary, I would say it makes perfect sense, and it is perfectly justifiable for cryptographers to work in the cryptocurrency space. Now let's turn the question to why cryptography matters to blockchain enthusiasts. And there's one obvious point that if it's not your keys, it's not your coins. And that's a very simple consequence of digital signatures, which I would not say is fancy cryptography these days anymore. A second necessary ingredient cryptographic ingredient to cryptocurrencies is how to solve the consensus problem. What does your software do when it sees two different views of history? Now, with the proof of work mechanism, your software can determine which of two different chains has more work put into it. And given that you expect that everybody on the network behaves likewise, you'll choose the chain with the most amount of work. Furthermore, the reason why you won't have this dilemma very often is because it's actually very, very expensive to produce alternate views of history. So those are two essential ingredients, cryptographic ingredients in cryptocurrencies, but there are also non-essential ingredients that can still make your cryptocurrency cooler, better, faster, you name it. For instance, privacy. Bitcoin famously does not have good privacy. I mean, it has pseudonymity, but you can still track the amounts as they move through the network. And if you sprinkle on top of that a little bit of zero-knowledge pixie dust, then you can actually hide the amounts that occur in the transactions, and it's no longer possible to track larger amounts. And if you sprinkle on top some more magical pixie dust of zero-knowledge proofs and ring signatures, perhaps, you can even hide which nodes are connected to which nodes in this transaction graph, thereby benefiting privacy even more. I mentioned zero-knowledge proofs just now, and the flip side of zero-knowledge proofs is oftentimes, they give you scalable verification. So I think that's best illustrated with a task that your node needs to do before it can communicate with other nodes on the network. So what you do when you install Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrency wallet, you download a whole bunch of data, gigabytes upon gigabytes of data representing every event that ever happened on the network. And then you set your node to sync. And syncing takes a while. And when it's finally synced, then it has an accurate view of the state of the system. Problem is that takes a while, and I tried to do this once on a Raspberry Pi and a portable hard drive, and it took me 2 weeks to sync the Bitcoin network. But if you sprinkle on top some magical pixie dust of snarks, well, then you can replace all this stale old data by a single efficiently verifiable cryptographic proof, pi. And then when you install your software, you need to download only a couple of kilobytes, maybe megabytes, but that's it. And you can verify that in the snap of a finger, or 2 fingers rather. So scalable verification is totally within the realm of possibility. In this last example, it illustrates how the need for fancy cryptography is, the cryptography itself is leading its own life. So this is zero-knowledge contingent payment. The idea is Alice wants to sell information to Bob, and using blockchains, we can eliminate counterparty risk. So either Bob does not get the information and Alice doesn't get the money, or Alice gets the money and Bob gets the information. Neither party has to trust that the other party will hold their end of the deal. This is something we do not know how to solve without blockchains. The reason why I chose this example is because all the ingredients for layer 2 protocols are here. And in fact, you can consider this to be a layer 2 protocol already, because the information that Bob wants to buy is sent off-chain in an encrypted form, encrypted under the key K, to Bob. Now, the reason why it works is because in addition to the encrypted information, Bob receives the hash of the encryption key K, and then Bob makes a transaction that can be spent by Alice's signature, and only if she provides the hash preimage K. So as soon as Alice collects these funds, then her transaction will be on the blockchain, and Bob, who is reading the blockchain, will obtain the key K, thereby allowing him to decrypt the information he was buying to begin with. Now, this works today using Bitcoin script, or in whatever cryptocurrency you like. It does need a scripting language, but if you look more closely at the cryptography, there is a way to achieve this without using scripting at all. And the answer there is the adapter signature. An adapter signature is a fancy signature scheme, which you can think of as including a procedure to encrypt a signature. But it's not quite the same as encryption because you can only do it once. It's like a mixture of the one-time pad with regular encryption. So instead of sending Bob the image under the hash function of the encryption key, Alice sends to Bob the encrypted signature with which she will eventually collect the payment. And that means that Bob's payment transaction does not need to include the hash image. And it also means that Alice can collect this payment either by providing the signature or by providing the encryption key. And the reason why I likened this to the one-time pad is because once you have 2 out of 3 from the key, the signature, or the encrypted signature, then you can get the third one for free. So the nice thing about this nice piece of cryptography is that all the transactions that hit the blockchain are indistinguishable from regular transactions that just move money around. It's impossible for an observer to tell, these transactions were actually part of a zero-knowledge contingent payment. So far for my examples on why cryptography is important to blockchains, I would say in summary, don't underestimate what cryptography can do for you. And I think that brings me to my last slide, where I hearken back to the first one where I drew the Venn diagram, and I'll let the animation speak for my hope for the future. Thank you. I think now is a good time to have a look at the questions over on YouTube. And hang on, let's move around. Well, if there are no questions, then let me introduce the next speaker, who is Jean-Philippe Aumasson. Jean-Philippe Aumasson for writing the book Practical Cryptography, run into the field, in contrast to other introductions which were excellent years ago. This book is actually modern. Well, Jean-Philippe Aumasson is also known for the hash function Blake 2, which was a SHA-3 finalist, and it was the fastest hash function until the publication of Blake 3, which is obviously also by him.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Hang on, I'm stuck on a computer that is not responding.
That was a cool talk.
Stop share. Here we go.
I can share mine now. Okay. I cannot share the video apparently. Someone stopped it. Share screen. Okay. So you should see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, I think I totally agree with you, Alan, when you mentioned the importance of crypto today. And I really feel like by far the most interesting crypto research today is to be found in the blockchain space. maybe this afternoon I was looking at Ethereum 2.0, what they were doing, all the sharding, proof of stake, and I find it super interesting. And the cool thing is that your work is not validated by papers; it's validated by redeployment. So you really have skin in the game. It's really good. Maybe I will start my talk when I'm here. So this is a joint work with Omer Shlomovitz from Zengo. So myself from Taurus, which is another company. That will be very, let's say, high-level, non-technical. So you don't need to run away if you're not comfortable with mathematics. And it will be focused on the offensive attack side and on the practical side. So that's the agenda. I would briefly explain what is threshold signatures, and then I will describe the attacks that we found. So threshold signatures, maybe many of the audience will be familiar with the idea of multi-signature, whereby instead of having only one party, one person, or one key validating a signature, you want to have a shared control, you want to distribute the trust, you want to distribute the capability to issue a transaction, because maybe you have $1 billion of dollars worth of Bitcoin, and you don't want to have one single person in your company, in your bank, for example, to have the access to your wallet. So you want to distribute the rights, you want to implement shared control, and typically in a bank, that's what you have to do by law to protect your wallets. So threshold signing is a system whereby you split the key, so to speak, into n shares. So we usually use the letter n to design the number of shares, and t, which is smaller than n, is the threshold, whereby you need at least t plus 1 shares to sign a transaction. And if you have fewer shares of the key than t plus 1 up to t, then you cannot sign anything and you cannot learn anything about the key. So this sounds familiar if you know the concept of Shamir secret sharing, which uses polynomial interpolation, and actually many of these constructions use the Shamir secret sharing. But it's using much more than this. So what I find really exciting is that it's a combination of many interesting primitives and functionalities, starting with homomorphic encryption. So Paye was quite a confidential niche crypto system. I mean, few people knew about Paye before because it was not really used for anything. But thanks to the homomorphic encryption, so it's been used in e-voting, and it's used in many threshold signing protocols. Sometimes you also have a variant of El-Gamal, in the exponent variant, that is used, but it's not exactly encryption. So it's also using most of the time some threshold secret sharing system, so often Shamir and with a Feldman verification layer, and zero knowledge proofs, because oftentimes what you need to do is to prove that, for example, one of the values that you send has some property. So you have proof of discrete log, you have range proofs. And more generally, the point of zero knowledge proofs is to demonstrate that you follow the specification of the protocol and don't try to cheat. And there are also some other components like the multiplicative to additive share conversion, which we're going to discuss a bit later when we describe the attacks. So what is cool is that, I mean, from the attacker's perspective, is that it creates a potentially wide attack surface. I mean, in other words, many things can go wrong, be it in the implementation, in the deployment, in the security proofs. And that I hope I can demonstrate today that it's not just fiction. So in terms of security, so of course it's social signatures. They're signatures, so you want it to be secure as far as signatures are concerned. The adversarial model is the typical one that you encounter in multi-party competition settings. What we find most of the time, we're dealing with static adversary. Some protocols out of the box directly support adaptive corruptions. But most of the time, you can transform a protocol that is secure in the static model to a protocol that is secure in the adaptive model. So it's malicious adversaries that can deviate arbitrarily from the protocol, and it's protocols whereby each party does an action in each round, and we consider the case that an attacker can, let's say, speak the last in a given round to create his input based on the input of other parties. Okay. There are many different protocols. Maybe one way in which these differ is the model in terms of honest majority. So you have protocols that are proven secure in the model of this honest majority, where you can have up to n-1 parties corrupted, and some other protocols which tend to be much more efficient are only proven secure in the honest majority setting. So it's kind of a trade-off depending on what you need. And you have different approaches, of course, and universal composability. I was saying like a few weeks or months ago, I was claiming, oh, UC is quite useless. I haven't seen many practical applications of it. But I think here the UC framework proves quite useful because it can give you significantly higher degree of assurance, especially in the case of parallel execution. Okay. So in terms of research, there's been tons of papers, literally tons of papers in the last 3 years. And it started with breakthrough result by Lindell and Genau and Goldfeder on ECDSA, because ECDSA is of course much harder than the Schnorr EDDSA case, which is much more, let's say, threshold friendly because of the linearity. So in ECDSA, you have to deal with K and the inverse of K, and that's the hard part to do in a threshold setting. And the goal of the protocol is how you measure the quality of a protocol or the value of a protocol. In practice is like the number of rounds, the computation you have to do, especially the computation of the proofs, and also some features such as identifiable abort, whereby you can identify which party cheated and blame the party that did not follow the protocols. And you have a cool feature whereby you can pre-compute a lot of the you can pre-compute a lot of the operations before receiving the message to be signed. So it's not offline in the sense that you don't communicate. It's offline in the sense that you can do it in advance before receiving the message that you have to sign. Okay. So in practice, like I mentioned initially, it's about implementing shared control, and sometimes seen as an alternative to systems that use trusted execution environment. If, for example, you only have software, if you only have microservice and a mobile application, then you don't have an HSM. So in that case, these kind of multi-party protocols prove really, really useful. And you have different types of deployments that we've seen. So you have the case where it's, for example, sharing between two parties like a service provider and a client, so two different entities. You have the case where it's been deployed in cold wallet systems of cryptocurrency exchanges. So for example, when you have shares on different types of component, for example, in maybe one mobile phone, one server on AWS, one cloud HSM on GCP, just to distribute the shares geographically, also in terms of teams, so who can control the shares. And the last use case is again in a single organization, but in a, let's say, in a more hot wallet form. And when mentioned that in that case, performance is a bit more important, so you care a bit more about speed. So again, a few words regarding the practicalities and the real world aspect. So what is important to have is protocols where you update the shares regularly, because otherwise an attacker can compromise potentially each of the parties one by one and ultimately recover sufficiently many shares. And that's something that ideally you would like to avoid. So the performance, I see many papers focusing on minimizing the amount of computation, but in practice, most of the time you don't really care about the computation. I mean, as long as it's not completely crazy, but the performance is totally really driven by the network latency or the network layer going through load balancers, NAS, and so on. So the important is to minimize the runs and to maximize the number of runs that can be done in advance using the pre-signing. And so it's not just fiction again, it's really used in reality. And you even have blockchain platforms that directly started supporting social signatures, directly or indirectly. I can cite to BLS signatures, which is a type of signature that is very, let's say, for a variety of reasons, very easy to turn into a threshold scheme. You might have noticed that Bitcoin just integrated Schnorr signatures, which is also much more threshold friendly. So I think that's something really that really get a lot of traction lately. So in terms of real world security, so if we forget about the papers and the security proofs for the moment, is what the kind of disasters we see in practice when we do security audits. I think I wrote that security proofs are maybe 20% of what makes a secure deployment of social signing. I just picked this as a random number, but you get the idea. I think what's really important is to, let's say, make the implementation easy to, let's say, easy to audit, easy to test. I totally agree with what Moxie said when he talked about readability versus writability. Omer and I, we've looked at many implementations, and like if you have to spend, I don't know, 5 days just understanding how the implementation structure works, then you might miss bugs that you would have found otherwise. And there's a lot of issues non-purely crypto that can affect a system, a TSS system. For example, crashes when you have bugs in the parsing, in the decoding, in the deserializing. If you have vulnerabilities in your dependency that are not related to the pure crypto protocols. So all this kind of usual boring stuff that you really have to think about because it can really jeopardize the security of your probably secure system. Another type of disaster that we've seen is when people implement papers, but they don't get it totally right. So I don't want to blame. We should not blame anyone, neither the authors of the papers nor the implementers. It's just how it is. But one source of confusion sometimes is when the developers are not familiar with the terminology and the notations used in the papers. You can also have problems when the encodings and the primitives are not specified in the paper. For example, the paper will talk of a hash function. It will not tell you which hash function to use. It will tell you, okay, let's send this data, but it will not tell you how to encode it, how to decode it. And the requirements are sometimes a bit obfuscated. So there's an example that I show here in the left hand on the slide. So that's a proof of factorization. So whereby you prove, the factorization of n without showing the factors. And there's a value called common input n. So it doesn't really tell you what it means. Common input is an input that is common, but what does it mean concretely? So the way it was implemented in when code base were reviewed, it was just picked randomly by the prover. And if you do this, then the proof becomes completely straightforward to forge because you totally control this common input. And the paper did not clarify, did not explain at all that the common input was not to be chosen by the prover, but was literally common input above the prover or the verifier, or could be provided by the verifier, but definitely not chosen by the prover. So that's the kind of problem that you can see. And I also list a few other issues that we found in practice, like non-safe primes, when you need safe primes, commitment hash that do not cover all the values to be committed, and so on. So the attacks that I will briefly present, they're perhaps the most impactful attacks that we found. They've been responsibly disclosed to the code base. It's not on proof of concept code. It's really software used by big organizations. It's really production software. So we've not exploited it to steal anyone's money. We're honest, but these could have been exploited. And as you will see, they really stress the importance of validating your input, and more generally of validating that the parties that participate through protocol really follow the rules of the protocols. So there's two attacks that we present. The first one is forget and forgive. I will not give too much detail, but it's very easy. Even with the details, it will be very, very simple. So this one is on the resharing protocol, where you update the shares. So you have a first group of parties. It's sometimes called a committee in the implementations, and they know the shares of the key. And after running this protocol, they will have different shares, but of the same key. Now you can start thinking about what could go wrong. So the way it works in very simple terms is, so each party, we do a secret sharing of their share, and then all the parties will receive it, and they will make a sum of the shares received, and from this they will be able to generate new shares. So the problem is the following. So what you can do, so the idea generally is that you will send shares to some parties that are valid ones, and to other parties shares that are not valid. And ultimately, what will happen is that some parties will have received the new share. So they will have overwritten the old share with the new one. And the other parties who have detected that they have not received the correct share because it's validated using the Feldman verifiable secret sharing, then they will keep the old share. So one subset of the parties will end up with new shares from the new generation, and another set of party will end up with shares from the last generation. So of course, if you combine shares from the new generation with shares from the old one, they will not be able to work together to issue valid signatures. So that's precisely what I described. And it sounds like a problem that cannot be avoided because the parties do not communicate and not say, oh, I've received a valid share, I received an invalid share, well, let's verify our shares consistency. And that's precisely the mitigation that should be implemented. So ideally, to avoid this problem, at the end of the protocol, you want to have something that's sometimes called a blame phase, where you verify the consistency of your shares. You don't erase the old ones directly. You verify that your new shares are working, and only if this test is validated can you erase the last the old ones. And that's a quote from the advisory that was published by the affected library. Okay, so that's concretely how could it be exploited. So again, it depends a lot on how, let's say, on how the protocol is deployed, on who controls the network. So there are many different exploitation scenarios. You can even think of a case of an attacker that is purely a network attacker and that did not corrupt any party. So again, it really depends on the deployment scenario. So why would someone do this? You can argue, oh yeah, but this attack, it's useless because most of the time there will be backups. So yeah, there will be backups. I mean, unless you do something really, really wrong. But you can do this, for example, you can make this attack repeatedly to harm, for example, the reputation of the service, or to lock the money for a certain period of time to prevent them from doing certain transaction. If it's a time where they want to do for a variety of reasons certain transactions, then this can be a DOS system because they will have to run the recovery processes to get back the shares. It can be used for blackmail and many other type of exploit. So the mitigation, like I discussed before, what they implemented, they added a new round, a final round, to verify that the shares are correct. And only if this is validated, they consider the shares as valid and as usable for the next iteration of the sending protocol. So again, this is not an attack on the protocol. The protocol was the General Call Feather of 2019. So it's really an attack on the implementation, the paper. We don't violate the security claims of the paper at all. So the second attack is maybe even simpler if we don't talk too much of the details. So this one is again on the same protocol. So on an implementation of the same protocol and on the MTA, on the multiplicative to additive share conversion, and specifically on the part where you send a person commitment. I'm not going to explain in detail why you send this person commitment, but maybe just the idea of this conversion protocol. So initially you have secret shares A and B that are multiplicative. So when you multiply them, you get the result that you want. But to run the multi-party computation protocol, what you need is additive shares. So you will have to turn these multiplicative shares into additive shares. So what you end up with is alpha and beta, such that alpha plus beta equal A times B. So at this point in this protocol, you need a zero-knowledge proof, of course. And the way it works is the following. So you will use let's say a fresh RSA modulus, fresh group, and two group elements, H1 and H2. And these will be used to make a person commitment. I don't know if we have a description of the commitment here. So these parameters, as I mentioned, they will be generated on the fly really for each iteration of the protocol. They're not hard-coded parameters of the protocol. Now the question is, who generates these values? And what are the expected properties of these values? So one simple way, I mean, each single problem in cryptography can be solved by having a trusted third party. So that's, of course, one option, and that's what some papers describe. But the other way to do it is that the verifier generates these values and prove their validity in zero knowledge. So prove that they are within certain bound and that they violated the security requirements, and that n is the product of p and q of two large primes. And the problem is that in this implementation that we found, the prover was not verifying the proof. So that turned out to be quite a disaster, because what happens, where is it? Okay, let me show you. Okay, the interesting part is here is the equation. So when you compute z equal h1 to the exponent x multiplying by h2 raised to the exponent eta. So can you maybe you can imagine what can go wrong if you're not sure that the value of n is correct, is n is not in a certain range, and if you can control h1 and h2. So it's very simple. So if instead of picking an n that is of the right size and multiple of 2 to big primes, you can, for example, pick an n that is really large, extremely large, or that is the product of small primes only. And you can, for example, pick h2 equal 1 and pick h1 equal to 2, for example. And then what you will end up with is h1 raised to the power of x. And your goal will be to solve x. So that's precisely what we have here. So if the verifier picks h2 equal 1, then your goal as an attacker is to recover x, given this simple equation, z equal h2 power x modulo n. So you have two different options. Like I mentioned, you can pick a very large n, so that you just operate over the integers, and you don't operate modulo n, actually. And then you can relatively easily find x. Or you can pick n to be a composite with small prime factors, and you can use Polygelman and do the same attack as on the e-voting system, on the voting system of Moscow, presented last year. Okay. So the exploit is relatively simple. You can do the same for all the parties, and then you will learn information on the shares of all the participants, and ultimately you will learn all the key shares, and you will be able to compute a signature. So that's a really high-level overview of the attack. We give some additional details in the paper, but as you can see, it's really straightforward. It's about sending parameters, sending an n that is not a valid RSA modulus, and then directly exploiting this to compute the secrets. Okay. So we have a few other attacks that we described. There's one we describe in the paper. There's one we don't describe yet in the paper because it's under responsible disclosure still, so it's still confidential. And that one is on threshold EDDSA. And as you will see again, it's relatively, the root cause is relatively simple. It's a problem that has been described and discussed a lot between many people, but the exploit is quite powerful. So we have the attack paper on ePrint, and since a few days ago, we have another paper about threshold signing on ePrint, which is a general survey of ECDSS threshold signing from a practical perspective. So if you're interested, I encourage you to have a look at this. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. I don't have YouTube in front of me.
Yeah, I do have YouTube in front of me. So let's first thank the speaker, and that's a little bit awkward when we cannot hear the thunderous applause, but we can certainly imagine it. And please, if you have a question, write it in the YouTube stream chat, and I will articulate it. Perhaps to kick off the series of questions that I'm sure is going to follow, you, in the Golden Shoe exploit, you use the group of unknown order, and one of the weaknesses is because n is chosen maliciously. What about using class groups there?
I think actually there's another protocol that is using class groups over quadratic fields. In this specific case, I don't know if you can directly replace this with class groups. But yeah, that's definitely an option.
Interesting.
I don't know so much about class groups actually, so you probably know better than me.
Yeah, we should explore that option more offline. Another thing that struck me as really interesting. Someone on YouTube is asking a question. What do you think about the FB recent paper claiming that ZIP 215 for standardizing ED 25519 verification is not done properly?
I don't have any opinion on this. Not read this zip. Yeah, I know what he refers to, but yeah. Well, I don't have much to say. It's you know, there's as many ways to do it as implementers. I think it's a really good work that they did, a really good overview. Would be nice sometime to standardize it, but then again, if you look at the standards of ECDSL, for example, the official standard that tells you to do a lot of checks and verifications. If you look at most implementations, they don't follow they don't do all the checks. But I think that's something very, very important. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I have one more question in regards to responsible disclosure. Since a lot of money is at stake, I wonder, how did that procedure go? Did they resist at all your desire to publish the attacks eventually? How does the process go?
So I cannot talk about all the details. There are different scenarios. So there's the scenario where, for example, you look at a piece of code in a completely, let's say, unsolicited way. The code is open source, and one day you're bored, you decide to have a look at it, then you disclose it. And there's the case where it's a paid audit and where there are really established rules. That's a bit simpler. So in that case, it was by looking at the open source code. What can I say? They've been, let's say, relatively open to this, and I mean, did not face any threat or anything. Is that what you have in mind? So,
yeah, exactly. Well, legal threats, perhaps, or just
no, totally not. It's not this kind of organization.
Okay, that's good to hear. All right, thank you very much, Jean-Philippe Aumonson. A very interesting talk. And now let's move on to the next speaker, who is Kenny Patterson. He's a professor at ETH Zurich. The first time I saw a presentation by Kenny Patterson, he was visiting my home university, and I remember he was speaking about how he and his collaborators had broken, I'm not sure if it was SSL, TLS, or SSH. The point, though, was even though the developers there are really top-notch cryptographers, and even though the protocol was provably secure, that doesn't matter because it was provably secure in a model that doesn't incorporate the message length. And of course, if you're proving security in the wrong model, then you don't get any security at all. And Kenny's talk back then showed how to exploit that. Kenny, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thanks for the introduction. So today I want to talk about some research that was done jointly with Dan Bonnet and Florian Tremer from Stanford University, California, about some side channel attacks that we found against some anonymous transaction schemes or anonymous cryptocurrencies, so specifically Zcash and Monero. If you're interested in reading more about this work after the talk, the paper was published at Usenix Security this year. One of the very nice things about Usenix Security is they have an open access model for publications, and the link to the talk is there at the bottom of the first slide, and I'll repeat it again at the end of the talk. So if you're interested in checking out the work in more detail, all of the details, more than you could possibly want, can be found in our Usenix paper. So let's just get things going by talking about Alice, the anonymous activist blogger. So here's Alice with her megaphone out in the real world. She's fomenting revolution on the internet, and she'd like to stay as anonymous as possible. At the same time, she doesn't have a real job, let's say, and so she would like to be able to use cryptocurrencies, which she's heard about, which she thinks are an excellent idea. She maybe heard Alan's talk earlier about the economic case for cryptocurrency. And so she wants to make a public key available on her website on her blog to enable people to send her, say, cryptocurrency donations. So she publishes her public key, PKA, for Bitcoin, let's say, classic Bitcoin, on her website, and sits back and waits for the donations to roll in. And of course, as we all know very well, if she's using Bitcoin, then she doesn't really have any anonymity guarantees or privacy guarantees whatsoever. So in the common scenarios where she sends some money to Bob using her private key, signing with her private key, or where she is receiving money from Bob sent to her public key, signed by Bob, then a network adversary, an adversary who can see the Bitcoin network, is able to observe transactions. They're immutably placed on the blockchain and can be analyzed in an offline manner. And Alice doesn't really receive, well, can't really expect to receive any privacy for her transactions in Bitcoin. And indeed, there are companies that specialize in breaking the anonymity of Bitcoin, creating connections between keys and real-world identities. There's a number of companies operating in this space and in receipt of large federal contracts for doing that kind of work. So if you want to remain anonymous, don't use Bitcoin. What should you use instead? Well, you want to use some kind of anonymous transaction system. And here, there's a large set of possible anonymous cryptocurrencies that have been developed and launched over the last few years. Prominent amongst those, and what I'll be focusing on today, are Zcash and Monero. And now the general idea of these kinds of anonymous transaction systems or anonymous cryptocurrencies is that we use cryptography as recommended by Alan in his talk to enhance the privacy and security of the transactions. So instead of sending an amount which is public to an address which is public, we're going to use cryptographic techniques to hide that information. We're also going to hide the source of the transaction by using encryptions of digital signatures, and then we're going to make use of zero knowledge proofs in order to prove to all observers that the transaction is properly formed. And this is, of course, important to stop people from sending more money than they have, or minting coins that they don't own, for example. So this kind of approach can make it difficult, maybe impossible. That's the design intention, to make it impossible for the attacker to be able to unveil the sender and the recipient of transactions in such a system. And of course, this is the counterpart where Bob is sending money to Alice. Okay, and I guess this is Alice's ideal situation, where Bob is sending her, say, Zcash. And so what we showed in this paper is that an adversary who sends, say, small transactions into the network to known public keys is able to figure out which peer-to-peer node in the peer-to-peer network that underlies the cryptocurrency actually belongs to the activist. So by observing network behavior, you're able to unveil the relationship between the public key and the node, which is responsible for operating with the corresponding private key. Okay, and this then enables you, for example, to maybe geolocate the peer-to-peer node or identify its IP address, and can ultimately lead to the identification of Alice as a real person. Similarly, we have attacks where we're able to observe the behavior of the network under normal usage, so without the adversary injecting payments into the network. And by observing which nodes react to which transactions, we're able to figure out which transactions are for the activist Alice. Okay, so putting these two classes of attack together, along with other attack vectors that we describe in the paper, we're able to show that actually Zcash and Monero at the time, when we did this work, did not really provide strong security guarantees or strong anonymity guarantees to their users in the way that they were advertised to provide. I should stress that at no point in any of this work were we able to create fake coins or to create fake transactions. All of our attacks were focused only on de-anonymization of network participants in these networks. I should also say that we then consequently, even though we may have wanted to, we were not able to steal any money in these networks. What we could have done was de-anonymize the recipients of certain transactions. Of course, we didn't do that either, being responsible researchers. So at a high level, what we provide then are remote side channel attacks on various components of the anonymous transaction systems. And here I want to stress the word remote because in fact, if you look carefully at the Zcash documents, for example, describing the Zcash system, it's clear there that the developers did not promise any security, anonymity, or privacy, or confidentiality, or any security properties at all, in fact, for the case where the attacker is co-located with, say, a node. So, for example, no protection against cache timing attacks, any of those kinds of side channel attacks. And that's why here we're focused on remote side channel attacks where the adversary is not co-located with the victim of the attack. And typically these kinds of attacks are harder to carry out because you don't have, say, perfect timing information. You are subject to network delays and network jitter, which makes doing certain kinds of timing attacks more difficult. At a high level, what we discovered for Zcash and Monero is that we could develop attacks that would allow us to determine the peer-to-peer node for any transaction payee, so payee being the recipient of a transaction, and then also linking diversified public keys for transactions in Zcash and Monero to a specific IP address. Additionally, for Zcash, we actually found a very simple attack where we were able to crash user nodes, actually crash them on a permanent basis. So even when the node restarted, it would immediately crash again. So this could have led to a significant denial of service attack against Zcash. We were also able to come up with attacks that had the potential to extract a user's secret viewing key. So that's a key used by a user to decrypt transactions and check that they are for that user. And also for Zcash, the ability to learn or to gain some information about transaction amounts by timing the proof generation. So this is a slightly different attack class, and I'll mention that a little bit more towards the end. So for the next chunk of the talk, I'm going to focus on the attacks where we determine the peer-to-peer node, so the attack here at the top. And then towards the end of the talk, I'll talk about how we were able to learn transaction amounts by timing proof generation steps. We should also here stress that we disclose these vulnerabilities to Zcash and Monero, and we did that in a responsible manner. So that links back to one of the questions that was asked of the last speaker. We actually had a very positive experience of working with both the Zcash and Monero teams to disclose these vulnerabilities and get them fixed in good time before we published our research. The attack techniques I'm showing you today are specific to Zcash and Monero, but there are general issues and general lessons to be learned here, which we think probably extend to other anonymous payment systems. We actually picked Zcash and Monero because they were the largest by value of all of the anonymous cryptocurrencies, but of course there are dozens more. And actually, what we found in doing this work is that Zcash and Monero are some of the best engineered anonymous cryptocurrencies. I fully expect that for some of the ones that are like, let's say, lower down the top 1,000 list of cryptocurrencies, the engineering standards might not be quite so high. And so maybe there's some fun to be had there for researchers. So as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on the two attacks highlighted in yellow here. And actually, most of the time I'm going to spend talking about the first class of attacks where we're de-anonymizing Zcash and Monero transactions. Okay, so let me start by talking about how we de-anonymize Zcash transactions. First, to understand how this works, we have to look a little bit in detail at the structure of Zcash transactions, how they're constructed using cryptography, and also how they're processed by a node when they're received by a node. So the general form of Zcash transaction TX is that it includes a commitment to a coin, which enables the recipient to check that the coin really is for them. And also the coin value and the decommitment value needed to check the commitment, encrypted under the payee's public key. So C here is a ciphertext, which is encrypted using Alice's public key if the transaction is for Alice. Okay, so Alice, on receiving such a transaction, can't tell that it's for her, except by decrypting it and checking that the format of the underlying plain text is correct. So those of you who know a little bit of cryptography might be able to immediately guess what's coming next. So what Alice will do, if she will do a trial decryption using her secret key, the public key ciphertext. She will either receive a note, essentially a coin, which we'll discuss a little bit more in a moment, or a failure. So if decryption fails, that means that the transaction was not for her. If it doesn't decrypt properly under her private key, then it was not encrypted to her. And at that point in Zcash, all processing stops and you return from the reception from this piece of code. Otherwise, you go further and you parse the note into a value and the commitment randomness, and then you basically recompute the commitment, the UTXO, in order to check that the coin is actually spendable. Okay. And of course, now at this point, this process, particularly step 4, involves a public key operation. So the commitment scheme used is actually based on public key cryptography. It's a kind of a Pedersen commitment, and that takes time. Okay, so cryptography is not completely for free, and so there's some processing time associated with this step. So what you can immediately see is that processing a transaction at Alice takes longer if the transaction is actually for Alice than in the case when the transaction is for some other user. So what that means is you could send a transaction to Alice, and if there's some way of observing how long the processing time is, you would then know that that transaction actually was intended for Alice. And so we need one more trick in order to turn this into a working attack, and that's to use some kind of ping message or keep alive message that exists in the Zcash system to complete the attack. So let me explain that next. So here's the attack. So Bob is sending a transaction to Alice. Then what the adversary does is an adversary sitting in the peer-to-peer network intercepts that transaction, sends the transaction to Alice, immediately followed by a ping message. And what happens next is that at Alice's node, the transaction is processed, followed by the ping message being processed. So the serial nature of the processing is actually something that's inherited from the Bitcoin client that the Zcash client was originally based upon. So here we see the effect of long-term legacy code being used to build a system. Okay, so we have serial processing of these two distinct messages, the transaction followed by the ping. The node will actually forward the transaction to the wallet where the private key is stored. The wallet is connected to the node. The wallet will do the processing that we talked about. We'll check the commitment if the transaction really is for the wallet, and we'll then send a response back to the node saying, yes, this one was for me. And at that point, when the wallet has concluded its processing, the node will then process the ping message and send back a response, a pong message, back to the attacker. So what the attacker is going to do, of course, is then time the amount of time it takes between sending the ping and receiving the pong, and that will leak some information about whether the wallet actually checked the commitment or not, and in turn that leaks information about whether the transaction was for Alice or not. So that's the basis of the attack. We implemented this attack and we tried it out remotely, and by remote here, I really do mean remote. So we had the attacker sitting in London in an Amazon cloud server, and the Alice's node and wallet running on a server in our lab in Zurich. And so several 100 kilometers between London and Zurich. And the difference in processing times that we saw between when a transaction was for Alice and when it was not for Alice was around about 1.5 milliseconds. And that time difference is exactly the time it takes to compute the commitment. And here doing this attack remotely then involves some sources of error, network jitter, for example. And you can see this here. So what we're doing here is providing a box plot. So you can see here that the average is the orange line for when the wallet is the payee, and down here when not. And you see there's some spread of processing times, or rather round trip times, before the pong message is received by the attacker. But this is actually a huge timing difference, very easy to measure on a local network and even measurable over a wide area network, as we showed in our experiments. So this is a truly remote attacker. This is an attack that can be carried out from anywhere in the world against any node. So how should we think about fixing this? Well, the fundamental reason that the problem exists here is that the peer-to-peer node and the wallet really are in different protocol layers or different protocol elements. And we should somehow separate the interaction between the peer-to-peer node and the wallet in a better way. We should isolate the wallet from the peer-to-peer node in a better way, such that this kind of timing becomes impossible. And the best way to do that is to make sure that the peer-to-peer node actually just acts as a database for the wallet. So the database, so the wallet is then able to talk to the database, get information about transactions and verify them. And that's completely decoupled from any network activity that the peer-to-peer node is involved in. This was fixed in Zcash, and actually Monero already had an improved design of this type, where transactions arrive, they're cached at the peer-to-peer node in a local database, and then the wallet on a periodic basis will fetch all of the new transactions and then do the verification of those transactions and figure out what new coins have been received at the wallet. So you might now be wondering, well, if this was already this kind of improved design that decouples transaction processing from peer-to-peer node operations was already extant in the Monero code, why was Monero vulnerable? So let's look into that next. Let's try and address the question, why was Monero also vulnerable? So here, very roughly speaking, is the code that Monero was using at the wallet for processing transactions. So basically, you would request the transactions from the node, you would process the transactions, and then when processing was complete, you would sleep for some period of time, 60 seconds in one of the Monero implementations that we looked at. And now, of course, you can see the source of the issue. The amount of time that you sleep for, or the total amount of time, sorry, taken to process transactions, is just the sleep time plus the transaction processing time, and that will still leak whether a transaction was intended for this wallet or not. So the trick is to send requests at fixed time intervals. So rather than sleeping for 60 seconds, you sleep for 60 minus the elapsed time taken to process the transaction. So you run a little timer and make sure that you always return or make the next request at the same time. At the same time interval, 60 seconds later, irrespective of what processing you did. Actually, though, Monero had another problem, which led to us being able to do remote attacks against Monero. And that was to do with the way that the Monero nodes were using locks and mutexes in processing transactions and handling network activity. So what we discovered was that Monero nodes would acquire a global lock when responding to wallet requests. And that made them non-responsive to other requests coming from the network. And so what this meant was that a remote adversary could observe the lock contention by simply sending requests at regular intervals to the peer-to-peer node. And then if it did not get a reply, then it would know that the peer-to-peer node was locked and was handling wallet requests during that time. And that gives you a remote way of actually timing how long it takes to process the wallet requests. If you send enough requests with a kind of fine-grained enough time interval, then you're able to use that to reconstruct the previous attack that I showed. So this is actually somewhat simplistic way of handling locks in the Monero peer-to-peer node, leading to a remote timing attack against wallets, enabling us to somehow look beyond the node itself and see what was happening in the wallet and extract timing information from there. Okay, so the right way to handle this, of course, is to use a proper in-memory database at the peer-to-peer node with a mature locking system. And this is really a matter of careful software engineering, and where software engineering interacts with security, it's not really a cryptographic issue, but it does lead to de-anonymization attacks against Monero. Okay, so I want to stress once more that all of this has been fixed in both Monero and Zcash. It took one of the teams a couple of iterations to get there because it required quite a lot of code changes and also a different style of architectural thinking about how the peer-to-peer nodes should be built. And here, for example, is the Zcash security announcement from September 2019. So this is now more than a year ago, acknowledging the research and talking about what users should do to protect themselves. And again, once again, working with Zcash and with the Monero teams was really a pleasurable experience here. Okay, so moving forward, now let me talk about the timing side channels that we found in the proof generation steps and how these might lead to attacks that reveal information about the value of transactions. So here again is a picture of Alice sending a payment into the peer-to-peer network for, say, Zcash. And these payments are accompanied by zero-knowledge proofs, which prove the correctness of the construction of the transaction. So, for example, it proves that Alice has the balance, or the total balance of the transaction is 0, that the signature underlying the encryption is correct, and so on. We don't need to really get into the details of what the zero-knowledge proof is doing, but one thing to know is that the zero-knowledge proof contains information about the value of the transaction, so $5 in this example. And what you might think is that the zero-knowledge proof, by design, it's zero-knowledge, should leak nothing about, for example, which entity the transaction is intended for. So it should leak nothing about the public key of Bob. It should leak nothing about Alice's signing key, and nothing about the transaction value. That's the design of a zero-knowledge proof, right? Specifically, the zero-knowledge proofs used, for example, in Zcash. But we found that's not true in a side channel setting. So if you were able to time how long it takes to create the zero-knowledge proofs, then you get information leakage about the value of transactions. And here is the killer graph that shows on the x-axis the value in Zcash coins of the transaction, and on the y-axis the running time required to generate the proof. And what you see is there's a weak linear correlation, at least in the kind of logarithmic sense, because here we have a log scale on the x-axis. So there's a weak linear correlation between the proof generation time and the value of the transaction. And this comes from, the reason this arises is somehow deeply embedded in the proof generation code, and it's to do with the way that the value of the transaction is encoded in a bitwise fashion, and how proofs are done, or how proofs are constructed for the bits of the value of the transaction in ZEX. I want to stress here that this did not lead to a real attack undermining the confidentiality of transactions, because you need to find a mechanism by which you can time the time it takes to generate the zero-knowledge proofs. So clearly, in a co-located attack setting, this kind of timing attack is essentially trivial. But remember that the Zcash developers explicitly rule out that kind of attack scenario from their as being something significant for them. However, I think this points to potential problems in the future. Who can say whether or not people will find realistic mechanisms to time the proof generation time for zero-knowledge proofs? In our paper, we list a couple of semi-realistic scenarios where proof generation might be timed. For example, it's possible that you might outsource the proof generation from a wallet, because proof generation is actually computationally intensive. So you might make use of third-party services to generate your proofs, for example, at which point maybe timing becomes possible. So this is merely to illustrate that all is not well in zero-knowledge land, that the proof generation code and zero-knowledge proofs in general are designed to function at all, and issues like constant timeness, the fact that the proof time should be constant independent of any of the values involved in the proof, is currently, let's say, for people working in zero-knowledge, a second-order concern, because it's hard enough to write code that just generates the proofs, never mind making it constant time as well. Hopefully that's something that after our work, people working on zero-knowledge proof code will start to think about and start to improve the quality of their code to remove this kind of potential attack vector. So coming to conclusions, one of the key takeaways here is that anonymity is hard. It's not enough just to layer on some crypto on top of an existing cryptocurrency, for example. The flaws are not only in the complicated cryptography, for example, the zero-knowledge proofs, but also at the protocol and the system level. So the timing attacks that we presented are not actually timing anything internal to the crypto operations. They're just doing timing against whether or not certain crypto operations took place at all. For example, recomputing the commitments in the Zcash case. And there's sort of another meta lesson here about being careful when you inherit designs from non-anonymous cryptocurrencies. So I mentioned that the Bitcoin client was used as the basis for the Zcash client, and that meant that the Zcash client inherited the serial processing of messages, which meant that we were able to use the ping and the pong network messages to time how long the crypto processing was taking. And so I think in the medium term, it would be good in this entire space to be looking at developing constant time crypto implementations to remove the class of timing side channel attacks of a traditional kind, but also very careful engineering is needed. Good systems design is needed to remove the sort of protocol level timing side channels that we exploited. As I mentioned right back at the start, our work was published at Usenix this year, Usenix Security 2020, and the link to our paper is there. You can also Google for our names, and you will find the paper easily enough. So final slide. This is just to highlight that I am leading the Applied Cryptography group at ETH Zurich. This is a new group established about 18 months ago. If you want to learn a little bit more about what we're doing, then we're on the web and you can see our work at that URL given on the last slide. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'll pass you back to Alan, who I think will moderate the questions at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Patterson. All right, there are a couple of questions on YouTube, so let's take them in chronological order. Thomas asks, what if Alice is generating a new public key after every transaction? This is in connection with the picture of Bitcoin privacy. So if Alice generates a new public key after every transaction, doesn't the privacy picture change, and how so?
Right, so there are systems in Zcash and Monero where you have diversified public keys, where you make diversified private keys, where you make many keys from one, and you use different keys in different transactions. But it turns out that actually we break that too, because the fact of the matter is that you still do crypto processing if and only if the transaction is for you under any one of your keys. And so we're still able to link a transaction to a node and check that a transaction is for a node. And so it's true, though, that if you had really genuinely uniquely generated keys per transaction, then many of these problems would go away. I believe that's true. Or you would need to continuously do the attack in real time to monitor which transactions belong to which nodes. So you would lose that kind of long-term association between a key and a node. That's true. I'm not sure how practical that is, though. I'm not really a deep expert on the finer aspects of, say, Zcash and Monero to know whether it's actually practically possible to change your key for every transaction that you do. I suppose people have to have a way of then discovering your keys in order to use them. But just to emphasize that the standard method for diversifying keys does not resist our attacks.
All right. The next question is, do you think that there are models vast enough to capture most side channel attacks currently not captured while still remaining practical?
No, it's a great question. So as we try to add more and more to our models, of course, they get more complex to work with, and then human error starts to creep in. So we think we've done a proof, but maybe we missed the 17th case in the analysis, right? Or maybe our model just wasn't right. And I think right back at the start, Alan, you referred to some really old work of mine now from 2009, 2010, which was about SSH. And there the models had got sufficiently complex that important protocol details got missed. And then the other thing as well is that these attacks that I described today are really arising at the protocol level or the system level. They involve cryptography, but they're not necessarily about timing internal mechanisms in the cryptography to leak bits of the key, for example. We also found attacks like that actually against Zcash, but I didn't mention them in this talk. But this kind of like system level timing attack is not something that we really are very good at formally modeling yet, certainly not in the crypto community. It's possibly something that's been addressed in the past by the formal methods community, looking not really thinking about cryptography, but thinking about this kind of system view of protocols. So we might find something there, and maybe using kind of more abstract formal models rather than the very fine-grained cryptographic models would be helpful in that respect.
All right, the next question. What's your analysis of traffic analysis on these peer-to-peer networks in general? Would Tor or a mixnet help?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let's see now. This is something we do address in the paper, but the details escape me right now about the extent to which using Tor guards against these attacks. I guess it makes it harder to link the public key directly to an IP address and to do the geolocation. But I think it still enables you to link the public key to a specific node, although then, actually with a logical address as a peer-to-peer network or a logical identity. But then it becomes harder to then take the next steps to de-anonymize that person. So I think the short answer is it helps, but it may not completely cure the problem. And in general, of course, I should mention that we're not the only people to have looked at anonymity properties of these anonymous currencies. There was a nice paper about a year before ours by researchers from the University of Luxembourg who looked at more or less kind of passive analysis of Zcash transactions, looking at transaction flows, looking at transaction values entering and leaving the anonymous network via exchanges and being able to correlate things. So there are multiple attack vectors to look at there.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Patterson. Let's imagine some more applause, which I'm sure the audience is making at home. And meanwhile, let's introduce the next speaker, who is Luca De Feo. Luca is very well known for his work on isogenies. Now, you may have heard that quantum computers are coming, and when they arrive, they kill RSA, and that's true. And when they arrive, they will kill the elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem, and that's true as well. But there is a piece of the puzzle in terms of elliptic curves that quantum computers are not known to be capable of attacking efficiently, and those are isogenies. This is a very interesting and promising branch of post-quantum cryptography because the public keys, the ciphertext, and the signatures can potentially be a lot smaller than anything produced by the competing branches of post-quantum cryptography. Luca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. So since you talked about post-quantum cryptography, let me start by saying maybe that this is not going to be about post-quantum cryptography. It is going to be about isogenies, but the protocols I'm going to show are not post-quantum. Can you see my screen, and is my voice coming through clear?
Yes. Both.
Okay. Perfect. Then I will start, if I can. Yeah. So this talk is about something different. This is about verifiable delay functions, but of course it is going to come from supersingular isogenies and pairings. So you have two very nice ingredients coming from number theory that are going to interact in an interesting new way. And I said it's not going to be post-quantum. That's because of pairings. Pairings are not post-quantum. This is based on joint work with Jeff Burgess of the Web3 Foundation, Simon Masson of INRIA Paris. And let me say that Simon is going to defend his PhD soon. So if you like this work, you should definitely contact Simon and talk to him. Christophe Petit of University of Birmingham and soon to be at University of Brussels. And Antonio Sanso of Adobe, who is also going to soon defend his PhD, but I think is still happy at Adobe. But of course, feel free to get in touch with Antonio too. Verifiable delay functions, and more generally, delay functions. This is a new way of thinking about cryptographically hard problems. If you come from a crypto background, you know that there's usually two kind of ways to think about time and hardness in cryptography. One is the complexity theoretic way, which is just doing asymptotic analysis. And so usually the question is how much longer it takes for the attacker to decrypt a message compared to the legitimate receiver of the message. And usually you want to show some exponential or sub-exponential separation between the two, but doesn't really tell you how long it is going to take. It's just a general average case analysis of relative difficulties. And it's usually based on some abstract models which do not really model the real computers, the real silicon that we use. The other standard way that we use in real-world cryptography is to count number of operations. So usually you would like to say this primitive, this block cipher is secure up to 2 power 128 operations. And then you need to define what an operation is. And then it may get complicated when you want to measure, for example, the difficulty of RSA, because the algorithms to break factorization are pretty complex. And so you need to do extrapolation based on the current records. This doesn't even account for how much parallelism you have. So it's more a measure of cost than a measure of time really needed to compute something. But here we now move to something different. In delay cryptography, we're really interested in a delay in the sense of a time delay. So something that is going to take a given amount of time, and you can control this amount of time. So historically, the first primitive in delay cryptography is time lock puzzles. And you can think of this as a sort of key derivation function, which has two algorithms. One is the standard key derivation function, which uses a trapdoor, call it T, and will just compute normally things. And then you have this slow key derivation function, which can be computed without the help of the trapdoor. So this slow key derivation function gives you a very slow way, but a configurably slow way to compute the same thing as the key derivation function. So you can think of these two mechanisms as a sort of encryption to the future, where you have Fred, for example, who wants to encrypt something to the Jetsons, and he will use the fast key derivation function to generate a key and then use this key to encrypt. And then someone, maybe Fred will start the job, but someone else will have to continue after Fred's gone, will keep computing this low key derivation function, and this computation will keep going for a while until the message arrives to the future. When the slow key derivation function is done, the message will be openable. And of course, this is based on the conjecture that if you don't know the trapdoor, you cannot do better than the slow key derivation function. What is this useful for? Well, one very easy example is auctions, sealed bid auctions, where a very easy solution would be, let's say you want to bid on an item, everyone encrypts its bid and sends the encrypted bid. So essentially everyone commits to its bid. And then when the auction is over, everyone reveals the secret key so that you can decrypt the bids. The problem is that some bidders may, for any reason, refuse to reveal the key. They may be offline. They may decide willingly to not reveal the bid because that would have an effect on the outcome of the auction. For example, in Vicray auctions, the winner pays the second highest bid. So if you estimate that you haven't won, but you are the second highest bidder, maybe you want to make the price go lower and then you do not reveal your bid, for example. So this can lead to some complex situations. And one solution is to use time lock puzzles, where the idea is that instead of using standard encryption, you can use a time delay encryption. And so if at the end, the bidders do not want to reveal their trapdoors, well, someone can still use the slow KDF to reveal the encryption. And so if you time this low KDF so that it runs longer than the auction, then you're fine because no one can decrypt the bits before the end of the auction. Of course, this gets quite expensive because you have to repeat this for all bidders that didn't want to reveal the trapdoor. So this can be quite complicated in a very large scale auction. And of course, you can imagine how you can use the same kind of mechanism for a voting protocol, for example, key escrow, etc. Let's move to something completely different, which is the title of the talk, verifiable delay function. This is a newer primitive, which was introduced by Bonneau, Bunce, and Fish 2 years ago. And here there is no trapdoor. Here we just want a protocol where a function, where evaluating the function takes a long time. So computing y equals f of x is a very expensive and long operation. And you want this time to be configurable again. You want to know exactly how long it is going to take. And verifying that y is equal to f of x, on the other hand, is an efficient operation which everyone can do quite easily. So this is a different thing. You can think like the Jules Verne book, the Tour du Monde en 80 jours, where Phileas Fogg needs to do this tour of the world in 80 days. But of course, you do not want to go along with Phileas Fogg to verify that he's doing the job in 80 days. So you want to just be able to control at the very end that he has done the job, that he has done this long trip. So of course, Phileas Fogg doesn't need a crypto protocol because he's a gentleman, so you can just trust his word. But we know that in the cryptocurrency space, not everyone is a gentleman, so you want to have this kind of verifiable delay functions. A very easy way, like you can see, this is pretty similar to proof of sequential work. So it's a proof of work where you can prove on top of that using parallelism is not going to help, unlike, for example, the Bitcoin proof of work. But you want this also to be deterministic in the sense that it's just a function. It's not something like the hashing proof of work where the output is just a random hash value. So what is this useful for? One simple protocol which is the basis of all applications of verifiable delay functions is this lottery protocol, where you have participants, call them A, B, Z, who want to agree on a winning ticket for a lottery. And the simple idea would be that each participant chooses some random data, call it S of X. And then the winning ticket is just the result of hashing all the randomness contributed by all participants to get one value, which is going to be the winning ticket. And then who has the winning tickets wins the lottery. But of course, you see where the problem is with this protocol. If Z is the cheating participant, he can just wait to see all randomness given by all other participants, and then he will brute force his own randomness until he finds a randomness which wins him the lottery. And so, of course, in this kind of protocol, everyone has an incentive to wait for everyone else before publishing his randomness. So what's the fix? One possible fix is to use verifiable delay functions, where you, instead of a hash function, use a verifiable delay function so that the function is going to be slow. So for example, each participant will have 10 minutes to submit its randomness. And so you make the verifiable delay function run for 20 minutes so that you know that no one can compute the outcome of the hash function before the protocol is over. And then of course, you want to be able to verify that some participant really won the lottery, and you want this verification to be fast. And so for this, you will use the verification protocol of the verifiable delay function. There's more applications of verifiable delay functions which are based on the same idea. For example, randomness beacons, which is essentially the same idea of the lottery. Many people contribute randomness, and you want the outcome to be some randomness that is not biasable. And this is usually the way that most blockchain projects want to use verifiable delay functions. There's also a very neat trick that's used in the Chia blockchain, which is a way to get rid of a synchronicity requirement in proof-of-stake blockchains. In proof-of-stake, you have this idea that to each proof of stake, you want to assign a quality, some parameter. For example, this could just be a hash of the proof of stake. And then you want to elect the leader for the next epoch as the one who has the highest quality. The problem is that this needs synchronicity because you need all the proof of stakes to be available at the same time in order to elect the leader. And so this requires synchronization. Synchronization is hard. We don't like that. And so the fix in Chia is to, instead of hashing the proof of stake, to run the proof of stake through a VDF with a delay that is proportional to the quality of the proof of stake. So in this way, you cannot cheat the VDF because you need to input this delay parameter into the VDF. And so your quality, your outcome of the proof of stake will only be available after some time. And if your quality is low, well, then you will be ready too late. Someone else will win the election. And so this is a neat trick that you can use verifiable delay functions for. So you probably know that there's lots of talk around the verifiable delay functions. Ethereum is investing quite some money into developing verifiable delay functions based on RSA. And Chia is also having its own competition on verifiable delay functions based on class groups. So you can look at these links if you want to know more about those. There is a third delay protocol, which only came very recently. So it's not even published, it's just an ePrint, which we call delay encryption. So this was based on joint work with Jeff Burgess. And this is a kind of, it's quite similar to the time lock puzzles, but here the idea is that instead of having a trapdoor, you have some sort of time capsule where everyone can put stuff into this time capsule, and putting stuff into the time capsule is efficient, doesn't require any slow protocol. However, the time capsule will take some time to be opened, and so only after a certain time is elapsed since the moment of the time capsule was created, only at the time you will be able to decrypt and see what's inside the time capsule. So this is a sort of many-to-one instead of one-to-one time lock puzzle, and has interesting application. Essentially, you can do the same thing as the auctions and the voting protocols, but they will be more efficient because you do not need to run the slow decryption for every participant. You only need to run the decryption once. Other interesting theoretical aspects of delay encryption is that delay encryption implies both time lock puzzles and VDFs, so it's a more powerful primitive than both. But I won't be talking about this in this talk. This will take us too far. What I want to talk about in this talk, as the title says, is delay functions. And as a warm-up, I will start with group-based delay functions, because these are easier to understand. So the very old idea to get these delay protocols, not verifiable delay function, just delay protocols, is to use repeated squaring in an RSA group. And so precisely repeated squaring in a group of unknown order. So if you have n, which is an RSA modulo, and you do modulus, and you do not know the factorization of the modulus, the only way you can compute x to the power 2 to the power a lot, say, is by doing squaring after squaring. So you start from x0, then x1, x2, etc., until you compute your x to the power 2 to the power delta. So for the time lock puzzle of Rivest, Shamir, and Wagner, this would be the slow k-derivation function. However, if you do know the factorization of n, then you have a shortcut, which is just compute 2 power delta modulo the order of the group, so modulo phi of n. And so if you know this shortcut, of course, you can compute much faster than doing repeated squaring. You can just do a basic square and multiply, which we run in log n operations. So this is the basic idea of the delay function behind Rivest and Shamir and Wagner, but this doesn't tell you how you make a VDF out of it. So to make a VDF, some things will have to change. Now, you still have the same setup where you have this group of unknown order, except that in a verifiable delay function, there's no trapdoors. So here, no one knows the order of Z mod n. So in practice, if you want to do this with RSA, this means that you need a trusted setup where someone is generating n for you, and then you trust this someone to not reveal the factorization of n. And now the evaluation of the verifiable delay function will be the same thing, will be just repeated squaring. And now, of course, if you knew the factorization of n, you could easily verify that the repeated squaring is correct. But we don't know this factorization, and so we need something more. And this is the cute idea that came just recently, last year, in the last 2 years. You have these proofs of exponentiation in groups of unknown order. You have two candidates, one is Pitchak and the other one is Veselowski's proof. And they are both very nice idea with slightly different features. The Pitchak argument is a recursive argument, which is rather expensive. It makes for a very large, quite large proof, but is based on a very classic assumption, the low order assumption in groups of unknown order. Veselowski is more efficient. It makes for very short proof, and it's based on a less studied assumption. It's essentially based on the Dock assumption. You both protocols then use the Fiat-Shamir transform, so they are proven secure in the random oracle model. And currently, I'd say that the Veselowski proof, because of its cheapness, is what is being looked at most. And one interesting thing for both proofs of exponentiations, for both VDFs, is that you have this option to remove the trusted setup if instead of using RSA groups, you use class groups. This was a question that came out just in the previous talk. What if instead of using RSA, you use class groups? Class groups are this very nice number theoretic object that for free automatically give you these groups which are very easy to instantiate, but for which computing the order is quite hard. It's going to be classically sub-exponentially hard. Quantumly is not going to be hard. That's one of the unfortunate things with groups of unknown orders. But as I said, we're not talking about post-quantum here. And so using class groups, you can just run these protocols with a nice no trusted setup instantiation, which is very cool. And so let me just focus on why are these protocols secure. So we said that we care about time. We care about how long it is going to take for the verifiable delay function evaluation routine to run. So we assume that this time is a fixed amount of time, which is configurable depending on how many squarings you do. So you're essentially using some key assumptions, which are a squaring is a squaring. You cannot do possibly faster than a certain number of nanoseconds. And you know this because you implemented all possible squaring algorithms on all possible silicon available. And really, you cannot do better than this number of nanoseconds at the moment. So this is an assumption that requires some experimentation to come with. And also, you need to have a machine that really does that. So you need these squaring machines, these squaring GPUs or squaring FPGAs to exist and to be easy to manufacture and cheap to buy. And then the other important assumption is that repeated squaring is really n sequential squarings. There is no trick to do this faster. And actually, depending on your abstract model, this is completely false. We have abstract models where we know that you can do this faster than by doing repeated squaring. But maybe these abstract models are too abstract and they do not really reflect reality. As far as we can tell, reality seems to be that repeated squaring really is a sequential computation of n squarings one after the other. But in practice, all these, like in theory, all these assumptions are going to be false. It's just that in practice, they seem to hold, which is the usual situation in cryptography anyway. For giving some concrete numbers, the current records that come from the Ethereum VDF competition is that on an FPGA, you can do one squaring modulo a 2000 bits RSA modulus in 25 nanoseconds, which is impressive. This is absolutely amazing. And so based on those numbers, if you want to do a delay of 1 hour, you would need 2 power 38 squarings. If you want 1 year of delay, 2 power 51, etc. So this is just to give you an idea of like what you need to really make these protocols. This will come back later when we talk about isogenies. And so now let's move to isogeny-based delay functions. Drinking pause. So isogenies, as Alan already said, they are related to elliptic curves somehow. So an elliptic curve, you probably heard of that. It's a cubic equation. It has a group law, which is pictured in this figure. And isogenies are the morphisms of these elliptic curves. Now, if you're not a mathematician, you don't know what a morphism is, doesn't really matter. These are functions between elliptic curves. A morphism is to, an isogeny is to elliptic curves what a matrix is to a vector space. So can you imagine vector spaces without matrices? That's exactly the same. You cannot really understand elliptic curves if you do not understand isogenies. And number theorists have been studying isogenies for centuries at this point. Well, at least 1 century, slightly more than that. So to give a concrete example of what an isogeny is, here are 2 elliptic curves defined over the finite field F11. And below I wrote the equation of an isogeny. So this is the map that goes from the left elliptic curve to the right elliptic curve, and then maps x, y to x squared plus 1 divided by x, and blah, 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 blah for the second coordinate. So in the figure here, you see what the action of these isogeny is. So you see that points on the left are maps on points on the right. The interesting bits to take out of this is that an isogeny is just a bunch of polynomials. And in this example, I'm giving you an example of a degree 2 isogeny. And the degree 2, you can see it in the polynomials. These are degree 2 polynomials. This is related. So the degree of an isogeny is going to measure how big the polynomials that represent the isogeny are, essentially. And if you want an analogy of something that might be more familiar to you, this map is very similar to the squaring map in a finite field. It's just a generalization of the squaring map to elliptic curves in some sense. And now you can see that I picture in red a point on the left. That's the kernel generator. That's the point that is sent to the point at infinity on the right elliptic curve. So just something that I could not draw on a plane, so I decided to draw it in red instead. But otherwise, it's a function. It's a function that maps every point on the left to some point on the right. And so now when we look at isogenies and elliptic curves, we like to look at them up to isomorphism. So isomorphisms are linear transformations of elliptic curves. So what you see on this slide is an elliptic curve being slowly transformed by scaling and slanting and other linear transformation to a new elliptic curve. An interesting thing is that we have something that's called the J invariant that classifies elliptic curves up to isomorphism, and that is very easy to compute given the equation of the elliptic curve. So in practice, when we do elliptic curves and isogeny, we do not care about exactly which elliptic curve you are using. We just care about the isomorphism class of the elliptic curve. So we're just caring about the J invariant. And so usually we will start drawing graphs of elliptic curves and isogenies. And so in this example, you see a graph with two vertices, two isomorphism classes of elliptic curves, and one isogeny between them. And usually there's a nice theorem that tells you that whenever you have an isogeny from left to right, you have something that's called the dual isogeny that goes from right to left. So usually we'll draw these diagrams as undirected graphs. And here you see two examples of isogeny graphs that come from a different setup. So on the left and on the right, I used different families of elliptic curves, and I chose to pick different families of isogenies. And the different colors represent different degrees for the isogenies. So can you guess which one of the two graphs is going to be useful for VDFs? Well, I'll give you the answer because maybe you're answering on YouTube, but I cannot read you. The answer is both. And actually, these two graphs also come from post-quantum cryptography. The one on the left is the one that's used by the C-side key exchange scheme, and the one on the right is the one that is used by the SIDH key exchange scheme. For verifiable delay functions, we will only use the blue edges in both diagrams. We will not care about the other colors. And so now let's focus on the one on the left, which has this nice cycle structure, and let's see how we do an isogeny VDF from it. The idea will be very similar to the group-based VDF. We will choose a subpath on the cycle, just a small piece of the cycle, whose length will be proportional to the delay parameter we are interested in. So we'll choose a quite long isogeny path, but probably not as long as the full cycle. Certainly not as long as the full cycle, because the size of the cycle is huge in isogeny-based crypto. It's going to be exponential, like more than the number of atoms in the universe. So you will use something shorter than the full cycle, but still quite long, so that it will take some time to compute this isogeny. And so you will fix the starting curve E0, and you will fix this arrival curve ET, such that the isogeny that connects them is a walk of isogenies of degree 2 or length T. Now, the degree is multiplicative, so T isogenies of degree 2, that makes for an isogeny of degree 2 to the power T. And now the verifiable delay function it's easy. It's just the isogeny. You just take a random point on the starting curve E0, and you pass it through the isogeny walk to compute the image point. And conjecturally, there is no faster way to compute this evaluation than computing sequentially one after the other these degree 2 isogenies. And so you see where it's coming back, this idea that an isogeny is a kind of generalization of the squaring map. Here we're really doing the same thing as squaring many times, but instead of squaring many times, we're doing many times isogenies of degree 2. But now, how do you verify this? Do you still have these interactive protocols like the PitchStack or the Veselowski protocols? Well, actually, no. You do use pairings, and actually you use one very nice bilinearity property of pairings. So you know that pairings are bilinear maps, but what you probably didn't know is that this bilinearity carries over to isogenies, and you have this very nice pairing equation, which tells you that when you run the points through the isogeny and then put them in the pairing, what comes out of the pairing is just the degree of the isogeny. And now it's left as an exercise, starting from this equation, how to verify the protocol. To be honest, there's a more efficient version of this equation, which gives you an even more efficient verification, but I won't go into the details. The nice thing is that this equation gives you a verification without the need to write any proof. The proof is of size 0 in isogeny-based protocols, which is a quite nice feature when you compare with other protocols. In Vesolowski or PitchStack, after you evaluated the verifiable delay function, you still need to compute the proof, which takes time, so delays the time for all the protocol to be set up, and also will take some space. In isogenies, you don't have that. Other interesting features, let's talk maybe about trusted setup, which is the most important thing here. RSA-based verifiable delay function need a trusted setup, but class groups do not. In isogenies, I did not explain why, but you do need a trusted setup. There is actually a problem with the way you choose E0, which needs a trusted setup to create the starting curve E0. The interesting thing for the trusted setup in isogenies is that it is much easier than the RSA trusted setup. It's something that is easily updatable, so that after Ethereum has done its own trusted setup, another blockchain could come and do its own trusted setup on top of the Ethereum one. And so the resulting instantiation would gain from the trust you had both in the Ethereum and in the new trusted setup. So you would be adding trust as you keep doing this updating, which is a nice feature. And also, unlike RSA-based trusted setup, this doesn't need to be synchronous. You can have the trusted setup run for a long time, and you will just accumulate trust as the trusted setup goes. In terms of attacks, classical attacks, again, nothing of this is quantum resistant. All these protocols have sub-exponential attacks, and they are pretty similar in the kind of resistance they offer. The interesting bit is that the sub-exponential resistance of isogeny-based cryptography, of isogeny-based VDFs, is coming from pairings, and this is a relatively well-studied problem, unlike, for example, class groups. I had this feature, this line about quantum annoying. You still have a little bit of resistance to quantum computing in all these kind of VDFs protocols, which is the idea that as long as quantum computers are pretty expensive, you can just reset the VDF at some point, and so you won't be vulnerable to quantum attacks. But this is not a full kind of quantum resistance. So let me just end with a concrete numbers maybe. The elementary step in group-based VDFs is a squaring. As we said, it's take x to x squared modulo n. The elementary step in isogeny-based VDF is something very similar. It's still a squaring, a quadratic polynomial, but a slightly more complex one. So you can reduce this by transforming the elliptic curves to an operation of the form x goes to x plus 1 squared divided by 4 times x times alpha, where this alpha is a parameter that is going to change through the cycle of elliptic curves. And so you will need as many of these parameters alphas as there are elliptic curves on the cycle. So this is a very important difference with RSA-based VDFs, because this is a huge amount of storage. So to give you an example of parameters, we will need the log P, which is about 1500 bits to get the same security as 2000 bits RSA. And if you are aiming for a 1 hour delay based on timings similar to the ones obtained by the Ethereum VDF competition, you would need an isogeny path of length about 10 to the power 10. This is a huge amount of these alpha i's coefficients. You need 16 terabytes to store all these alpha i's. And you need to read this very fast from memory in order to evaluate the VDF as fast as you can. So assuming the speeds of the VDF competition, you will need a throughput of 4.5 gigabytes per second, which is a doable throughput on high-end hardware, but it's still very expensive to get. And we showed some storage speed compromises in our paper on VDFs, but it's a tough call because if you reduce storage by increasing speed, then you have a counter incentive to reducing storage, because usually if you're running, for example, for an election in a proof of stake blockchain, you want to be the first to compute the VDF, maybe, or you want to compute it as fast as possible. So doesn't really work to slow down the VDF to use less storage. So this is problems that need more work. So this is actually a very nice problem to me, to understand the impact of these large memory requirements, to understand if the trade-offs are reasonable. Also, a very interesting problem would be to remove the trusted setup. Unlike the RSA framework, where the trusted setup has to be there because it's obvious someone needs to generate N, unless, for example, you use UFOs, unknown factorization objects. In the elliptic curve isogeny-based setup, it's not clear that we need the trusted setup. There is no fundamental reason why we would need it. It's just that we don't know how to do it without it. And so, of course, then there's more questions around it, like having more advanced construction, like this delay encryption we just discovered. And of course, looking really into investing money to develop this stuff. So my motto is just add isogenies and see what comes out. And I hope I convinced you to do the same with your problems. So thank you very much. And I'm now ready for questions.
Amazing talk, Luca De Feo. Thank you very much. As we enjoy the imagined applause and as we wait for questions to appear on the YouTube stream, I have a question of my own. In the picture where you draw the isogeny mapping points on the left to points on the right, there are colliding points. But then a few slides later, you say that with the dual isogeny, you can go back. How does that work? Because it seems like you're losing information here.
I did say that you can go back, but I did not say that the dual isogeny is the inverse map of the original isogeny. So the colliding points is normal, and you can see that this is a 2-to-1 map, and it's related to the fact that it's a degree 2 map. So it is going 2-to-1 the same way that the square function is going 2-to-1. Is mapping a and minus a to the same square. So this is a completely normal fact. And what happens with the dual isogeny is that when you compose an isogeny with its dual, the composition of these two maps is scalar multiplication on the starting elliptic curve. And it's going to be exactly scalar multiplication by the degree. So in this case, it will be scalar multiplication by 2. And like this coincides with the fact that if you know something about elliptic curves, you know that multiplication by 2 is a 4-to-1 map on elliptic curves.
All right. Since there are no questions on the YouTube, I have a second one. What would be required to eliminate the trusted setup?
So let's maybe first say where the problem is coming from. The problem, where is it? Here. The problem is that there is an attack to this protocol if the starting curve has a special property. So for example, the two elliptic curves you saw in my previous example, y squared equals x cubed plus x, this is the typical case of an elliptic curve that has a very special property. So this special property is the fact that we know the endomorphism ring of this elliptic curve. So this is a kind of similar problem with the unknown order assumption. Here, instead of needing a group of unknown order, you need an elliptic curve of unknown endomorphism ring. So there is still some unknown structure that you want to do this thing. And now the problem is that all elliptic curves we know, all supersingular elliptic curves we know how to construct have known endomorphism ring. So that's a pretty tough problem. So we would like a curve with unknown endomorphism ring. And we know that if someone magically gave you a random elliptic curve, a random supersingular elliptic curve, it's very hard to compute its endomorphism ring. Actually, this is one of the basic problems that if you could break, you would break all of isogeny-based cryptography. If you could compute the endomorphism ring of a random supersingular elliptic curve, SIDH would be broken, CSAT would be broken, everything would be broken. So this is a pretty strong hypothesis, a pretty strong assumption, or pretty weak assumption, if you prefer. The problem is, how do we do this random sampling of elliptic curves? There is one way, which is start from an elliptic curve of which we know the endomorphism ring, and then do some random walk in the isogeny graph until you land somewhere. The problem is that this random walk process is actually going to give you the endomorphism rings of all the curves on the path you encounter on the path. So the person who does the random walk will know the endomorphism rings of these elliptic curves. So we need some trusted party to do this work for us, and then forget about the work. So there you have the trusted setup. The interesting thing is that it's very easy to do this in a distributed manner where many participants do each one bit of the random walk and then publish a zero knowledge proof of that they really did this random walking process. So it's quite easy to implement, and it's actually a nice challenge, I would say, to do this. And yeah, sorry, to complete the answer, and I said that we see no reason why this should be so. The thing is, there is no fundamental reason why there wouldn't exist an algorithm that lets you just draw super singularity curves at random. It's just that we don't know this algorithm, and it's one of the major open problems in isogeny-based cryptography at the moment. Honestly, I don't know if it's solvable. Maybe not.
All right. In the meantime, there's been a question on YouTube. Someone asks, do you believe that there might be any way to overcome the squaring takes 25 nanoseconds assumption, for example, for another underlying primitive operation? Do isogenies already overcome this, perhaps?
We did not try to implement isogenies as hard as people have tried to implement squaring modulo n. So my numbers were based on the estimate that evaluating an isogeny should take essentially twice as much as computing a squaring, because you see there's the square polynomial and then you have a multiplication by the inverse. So it should be, actually it's 3 times, because it should be 3 multiplications. So isogenies are not going to give you anything better than squaring, I guess, in this respect. Actually, there's one open question about isogenies. What's the minimum number of multiplication needed to evaluate an isogeny? I conjecture that it should be possible to prove that the minimum number of multiplication is 2, but the best formulas we know use 3. So this is already of a problem. And so when I say the best formulas we know which are useful in the VDF setting, to be precise. So this is one other problem I really like, and for the moment I have no attack avenue on. There is one little difference between the RSA setting and the isogeny setting, is that in RSA, you want to do squaring modulo n, and n is the output of the trusted setup. So you cannot really start constructing your hardware before you know n, because you want to optimize for the specific n, but this n is the outcome of a trusted setup. So now if you change the trusted setup, you have to scratch your hardware completely and restart from the beginning. In isogeny is different, because the p modulo which you want to compute the squarings, well, the polynomials, is a fixed parameter which has no secret in it. The only part where the trusted setup is needed is for the starting LET curve, but this starting LET curve is only going to influence the first few steps of the walk, so it shouldn't really need you to redo everything from scratch. You would maybe redesign the hardware to take into account the fact that you're using a new LET curve, but that wouldn't probably likely affect much all the process. So there's this minor difference. But in the end, no, you still have to live with this idea that the only way to know what's the best time to compute this operation is to really implement them on the best hardware you have. And so do FPGA stuff, and then maybe press your own silicon in the end to get your chips.
All right, looks like we ran out of questions. So let's thank the speaker, not just this speaker, Luca De Feo, but the other speakers as well. And of course, thank you to the audience for tuning in. It's very, very heartening to see that despite the fact that this event is not taking place on site, there are still, at some point, there were 35 people tuning into the stream, and there were double that in terms of registrants to the Eventbrite. So that's very, very good news. And hopefully the next event will take place in person again. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.